Thanks, Angela, for this really, really generous and kind introduction. I had very bad jet lag last week and was thinking in what state I would be if I was still jet lagged trying to present this. It would not have been good. My my late 30s have come into sharp focus in this trip. So it's my first time in Durham, and I'm so super delighted to be here. It's also my first time in Edinburgh, and it's been very lovely visiting. I don't know if you know this, but Melbourne, where I'm from, is experiencing a really intense heat wave at the moment. We've had a lot of over 35 days. So it's been a great reprieve to be here. I want to thank, of course, Angela for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. I want to also thank the University of Melbourne, who is supporting my trip and visit through a Diocesan Fellowship, and of course, the University of Edinburgh. So what I want to talk about today concerns a particular psychotropic drug that is fitted with an ingestible sensor. But before we get to that, we know that psychotropic drugs are a ubiquitous element of how mental ill health is moderated and treated. They are often encouraged and prescribed alongside psychotherapy for a range of experiences, ranging from mild distress and mood changes to more complex issues related to things like complex trauma or prolonged trauma. Since their development in the late 1940s and early 1950s, psychotropic drugs have radically transformed mental health care. Although various drugs have been used in previous centuries to temper moods, such as laudanum, which I love referring to because as much as I know a lot of the historical horror stories about it, it sounds like a very romantic drug. So laudanum and other opium formulae, lithium, chlorpromazine, imipramine are among the first and most significant prescription psychotropic drugs of the mid-20th century. These drugs have shifted the treatment of mental ill health from the talking cure, which of course endures, and surgical operations, such as the now discredited lobotomy, to a more sort of chemical route, more chemical devices, despite the significant criticisms of the so-called chemical cure, viewed by some, such as Joanna Moncrief, as, I'm quoting from her, in some cases, a chemical straitjacket. Psychotropic drugs have dramatically altered the course of treatment for people diagnosed with psychiatric disorders, while also spawning a hugely lucrative global industry. Over the past few decades, the development of these drugs has continued apace, with newer products promoted as having fewer side effects and being more effective. They're regularly launched onto the market. However, despite all this, the experiences of people taking these drugs vary immensely and can be defined by quite problematic and distressing embodied side effects. So in my project on borderline personality, for example, when we conducted qualitative interviews and spoke to people about their experiences of various forms of treatment and care, over and over, pharmaceutical drugs comes up as having very sort of mixed impact on their life. And embodied changes is something that people bring up very frequently. So alongside this rapid expansion of drugs, the broader digitalization of health and mental health has generated further changes in how care is shaped. The digitalization of mental health is extensive and firmly embedded in certain models of care, whether one is referring to institutions such as psychiatric services or to private individual practices of self-care for well-being. So in September 2023, I published this book called The Artifacts of Digital Mental Health. I discuss in this book how we have seen a range of technological changes, such as things like virtual psychotherapy or a broad variety of smartphone apps. Some of the popular ones include Calm. This is one that people bring up with me all the time. And then there are apps that are more sort of dedicated to tracking mood, things like Mood Fit or Mood Kit, for instance. And we also have the rise of apps that aim to offer support or claim to offer support through chatbots powered by artificial intelligence. So things like Wiser and Wobot, for example. And of course, we also have wearable devices that are not technically intended to be for mental health, but also purport to target markers or alleged markers of mental health challenges. And both Fitbit and Apple have tapped onto that market. It's not, I have a lot to say about this, and we can talk about that later. It's not really the topic of this particular presentation. So these examples signal that the experiences and relationalities of mental health care have become profoundly digitalized. So in an article that in 2017 was aiming to sort of track these changes and delineate sort of a critical research agenda on digital technologies in health, Emma Rich and Andy Meyer observed that apps and wearables are fast becoming part of everyday life, and the endpoint of this trend, they say, seems likely to be the emergence of the ingestible sensor. Now, of course, the culmination of those developments remain unsettled. We know that technology moves very, very fast. While that is the case, the 21st century has certainly witnessed the convergence of the entanglement of drugs and digitalization. And the ingestible sensor stands as an example of that, or perhaps epitomizes how the chemical and the digital have become intertwined. So the case study today concerns the 2017 approval of Abilify MySite by the Food and Drug Administration, which is a federal agency of the US Department of Health and Human Services. In addition to being a psychotropic drug embedded with an ingestible sensor, Abilify MySite actually combines multiple very well-known technologies: an app, a wearable device, and a digital portal. Now, an ingestible sensor refers to a sensor that can be swallowed by the mouth, journey through the body's internal system, and be ingested. And it's typically at this point that data is going to be collected and transmitted, and apparently safely excreted completely or partially. Now, an early reference to ingestible sensor, of course, predates 2017. In 1957, in an article by two medical engineers, Jacobson and McKay, they describe the use of what they call a small radio transmitter or radio telemetry capsule that, quoting from them, simultaneously transmits pressure and temperature data during its passage through the alimentary canal. Ingestible sensors, of course, have gone through multiple iterations since the late 1950s, but they have very much simulated a lot of research in the area of gut health. For example, through gas sensing capsules. One of them was developed quite famously at RMIT University in Melbourne, where I used to be based, and they're meant to monitor changes in the gut due to diet. And in mental health, it is in 2017 that we witness a major development in the shape of the psychotropic drug embedded with an ingestible sensor. Now, again, looking to before 2017, this is a newspaper clipping from 2002. Abilify by itself, without MySite, is a standalone chemical drug, one that has existed for a while. Its active chemical compound is aripiprazole, and it was first patented by the Tokyo-based Otsuka Pharmaceutical in 1988 as a potential antihistamine, though at the time it was not named. Now, this phenomenon of testing a chemical compound for something, but then we discover that it's actually useful for something else is not that rare at all. The discovery of Viagra followed a very similar trajectory. So in 2002, back to aripiprazole, it was approved as an atypical antipsychotic by the FDA to treat schizophrenia and acute treatment of manic and mixed episodes associated with bipolar 1 disorder. This is a quote from the FDA. And as an adjuvant therapy for treating depression in adults. The FDA's approval of this drug as an add-on treatment for major depression was delivered in 2007, so 5 years after it was approved. And it was followed in the US by a very active advertising campaign presenting Abilify as a promising drug that can be added to another antidepressant, despite being an antipsychotic. Beside schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression, aripiprazole may also be prescribed, citing from the FDA, to treat irritability associated with autistic disorder and Tourette syndrome in pediatric patients. As an atypical antipsychotic, aripiprazole's mechanism of action is understood to center on brain activity by acting on serotonin and dopamine receptors. Now, the inclusion of aripiprazole as an add-on treatment for depression and its purported action on brain receptors provides a really important context for its emergence as an ingestible sensor. The incorporation of something like depression in the array of diagnoses that is associated with aripiprazole is part of a broader trend in how pharmaceutical drugs are advertised, especially in the US. So Joanna Moncrief is or she identifies as a sort of critical psychiatrist. And for her, this phenomenon is connected to how atypical antipsychotics have become framed, discussed, and marketed. So she points to bipolar disorder as an example, and she notes manufacturers successfully transformed perceptions of the condition from being a rare and distinctive form of severe madness to the more common and familiar experience of intense and fluctuating moods. Now, of course, we can find problems with the way she describes this particular diagnosis, but her point is that they managed to change or to sort of influence how the diagnosis became understood more publicly. So in a similar manner, people experiencing depression could be included as potential consumers of atypical antipsychotics. In addition, and really important to understand the sort of brain technology nexus that is at the center of Abilify MySide, the expansion of atypical antipsychotics relies on the now common framing of mental ill health as a chemical imbalance. Within this framing, the work of these drugs is put forward as assisting with achieving balance in the receptors of the brain. So, for example, Moncrief also cites from Otsuka Pharmaceutical directly, and in 2012, they wrote that bipolar disorder is caused by an imbalance in some key chemicals in the brain, citing from her, that can be adjusted by antipsychotics. So aripiprazole has been marketed as having the simultaneous ability to simulate and block dopamine receptors. So acting on brain receptors by balancing or fine-tuning them is a widely used explanation for describing not only mental ill health, but also the work of drugs, the work of antipsychotics. This chemical framework has been shown to be chemical imbalance framework has been shown to be very popular among psychiatrists and also among the general public. Despite a lot of accusations of a lack of empirical evidence, this critique emerges every now and again in the newspapers. I don't know if it's a thing here, but certainly in Australia, it is something that I see a few times every year. And also there have been criticisms that the idea of the chemical imbalance, that the popularity of it reflects problematic connections between psychiatry, the pharmaceutical industry, and marketing tactics. So there is a pretty sort of layered political context that enables Abilify MySide to emerge. So it's against this like social and political background that Abilify MySide arrives onto the scene of digital mental health at the nexus of brain and technology. Now, this nexus is characterized by technology-enabled augmentation of the brain as the true location of mental ill health and to some extent mental health itself. whether for what might be deemed severe or mild experiences of distress. Now, there is a larger societal trend here identified on the slide by Martin Pickersgill, whereby individuals diagnosed with a mental disorder are often identified by a range of actors as being, at least in part, their brains. So the example of Abilify MySight emerges in this context. It is the first digital pharmaceutical in mental health care. It's a drug embedded with a digital ingestion tracking system, a sensor that is known as an ingestible event marker. Prior to the approval by the FDA, Proteus Digital Health, which partnered with Otsuka Pharmaceutical to make the drug. Is everything okay? Yeah. They had been piloting this drug in smaller hospitals in the US. And it should be noted that Abilify MySight is approved by the FDA not for improving medication adherence, but rather for tracking and monitoring ingestion. There is a press release from the FDA in 2017, which outlines Abilify MySight's prescribing information, i.e. the labeling notes, the ability of the product to improve patient compliance with their treatment regimen has not been shown. So they were very explicit about this. And yet, the pharmaceutical and technological corporations involved, which are Otsuka Pharmaceutical and Proteus Digital Health, clearly saw the potential, because in 2015, what was called the Proteus Digital Medicine Platform also received FDA clearance, and it was aimed at measuring and quantifying adherence. So what we see then is the sort of assembling of different technologies and different potentials, including the chemical compound of the drug itself, packaged into Abilify MySight. Now I can't go forward. Oh, there we go. No. Back. There we go. Good. So the integrated system known as Abilify MySight comprises of several elements that have to communicate together through Bluetooth technology. And they're meant to work in tandem if it works well. So the tablet incorporates the chemical compound, aripiprazole, and the ingestible sensor. The wearable patch is designed to be worn on the lower edge of the rib cage. There is a smartphone app that is also connected to the system, and a digital portal called the MySight dashboard. Now, the wearable patch, acts as a signal receiver and what they call an activity tracker, and it records when the pill is taken through a reusable Bluetooth data pod. I let you digest this system while I drink some water. So the ingestible event marker is a 1 millimeter sized sensor, apparently the size of a grain of sand, embedded within the tablet. It's made of cuprous chloride, otherwise known as copper, magnesium, and silicon. There are a lot of other ingredients as well, but I'm not going to list all of them. And it releases a signal to the patch when it encounters stomach acid. When it encounters stomach acid, the magnesium and cuprous chloride within the sensor react to activate and power the device and communicate a signal to the patch tracking ingestion. This information is then transmitted to a smartphone app called MySight. So while the FDA evaluated and approved Abilify MySight solely for tracking ingestion, the patch and the app can track and record a lot more data, which is going to be very reminiscent of any mental health and meditation app that you might have come across. As the wearable patch is intended to be changed weekly, the instructions indicate that it should be worn when showering, swimming, and exercising. So there is this sort of habitual embodiment that is expected out of wearing the patch on the rib cage. Based on sensing the body's movements, the patch automatically tracks and records via the app individuals' steps taken, which I'm sure we've all done, and data on rest. On the US Apple App Store, it's impossible to find the app if you don't have access to the US Apple App Store. But we find out that the MySight app further enables the recording of moods using emojis called My Moods. Again, very similar to mood tracking apps. And the quality of rest using a star rating system called My Rest. The app also features a coping library where users can access ideas on practices such as listening to soothing music, deep breathing, and quality time with pets. The affordances, what fascinates me about this is that the affordances of the app are incredibly common. Like, it's very easy to find free apps that offer that sort of activity without being tied to any kind of pharmaceutical drug. So they've tapped into something that is very popular and already exists freely. Now, Abilify MySight is only available in the US in specialist pharmacies. Requires a prescription for use, of course. And an individual who is prescribed and agrees to take Abilify MySight, and I use that phrasing very intentionally because we know that being prescribed something doesn't necessarily mean that you agree to take it. And I think in the context of mental health, that's really something that has to be emphasized. So when an individual is prescribed and agrees to take Abilify MySight, they also agree to share data on the ingestion of the drug with their primary healthcare provider. They can choose whether to grant access to their digital portal to other healthcare providers, family members, or friends. While someone who takes this drug can give access to the portal to any number of health professionals, the number of people who are deemed to be part of one's support network, so friends, family members, carers, the number is limited to 5. Now, medication adherence and compliance to treatment are really prominent concerns in biomedical approaches to mental health and ill health. It's well known that many psychotropics and antipsychotics can cause a range of quite distressing side effects. As I've noted earlier, while it is unclear whether an ingestible sensor can improve so-called adherence, and the FDA has not approved Abilify MySight for this purpose, there certainly circulates a constellation of potentials in the emphasis on the ability to track whether and when one is taking medication over time, also tracking a whole range of other activities that are part of everyday life. This capability extends to the large data that the system can collect beyond whether I have ingested my medication. Now, the socio-technical logic at work here is that more data over time can provide insight into adherence and may encourage more sustained adherence to treatment through the development of habitual tracking and monitoring, something that a technology like Fitbit often relies on as well. Now, on adherence and compliance, we see a similar trend in some areas of psychiatric research, not all of them, of course, where some clinicians are increasingly turning to computer sciences to study how technology and data analytics can measure and improve adherence. Within this framework, harnessing data to understand how people take their medication has the potential to improve treatment, compliance, and ostensibly the quality of care. Harnessing data on understanding how people take medication, not a long qualitative interview where people explain to you how they take their medication. We're talking about data collection through wearables, through apps. On this view, issues such as privacy and individual empowerment can be addressed through the technology itself. Relatedly, the technology is positioned as revealing data patterns rather than being agential in co-producing patterns with users. Such perspectives on technology typically leave unexplored or minimized the sort of affective entanglements co-produced with users, their social worlds, and the technologies. The everyday nuances and social dimensions of ingesting medication are left open and unexplored. Here, technology can be an enhancer of treatment and a tool of progress that can produce an accurate and objective measurement that in turn can apparently be used or harnessed for improved decision making. Now, the critical humanities and social sciences literature on psychotropic medication broadly and antipsychotics specifically has emphasized the very complex social, economic, intimate, embodied contexts in which medications are prescribed, taken, and rejected. I'm thinking of authors like Simone Fulliger, Wendy O'Brien, Adele Pavlidis, and Elena Trivoli, for example. Nonetheless, the paradigm of adherence and compliance remains a very conspicuous concern in some areas of psychiatric research. And this perspective, unfortunately, seldom acknowledges the everyday complexities of taking medication outlined in social research. So, against this view, scholars in fields like STS, science and technology studies, critical algorithm studies, and critical data studies, digital health, they have pointed to the increased harmonization between medical institutions and marketization. So Anthony Ryan Hatch is a sociologist, and he called Abilify MySite a killer application. I'm citing from him, a killer application involves profiting from the hottest new technology. Their effectiveness for health is determined not in the clinic, but in the marketplace. Hence, whether Abilify MySite is tested and proven as effective on defined symptoms is a matter for corporate interests, corporate investment, and consumer choices in the marketplace, not the clinic or the laboratory. I have a few issues with this view, but it does sort of illustrate how the social sciences have responded to the drug. This criticism points to the intersection of the marketplace and medical institutions, and how the digitalization of health has both alleviated in some ways, but also entrenched social and economic inequalities across the world. We are living in an era of increased digitalization that can generate what Peterson and Iliadis have called sometimes questionable experimentation and profit. Now, for some, Abilify MySite is one such questionable technology designed for profit rather than well-being, and the ethical implications of this ingestible sensor are problematic on several levels. The view that Abilify MySite might have as its aim profit over well-being is, for example, demonstrated in the stark absence of mental health service users, including people who have taken Abilify and Abilify MySite from the regulatory processes of the FDA, something that Diederik's has observed in their piece from 2019. In this debate, an important point to consider is how Abilify MySite is positioned as possibly valuable for people who experience severe mental ill health. People living with diagnoses deemed severe or complex to treat. We know that they are frequently stereotyped as difficult, volatile, non-compliant with treatment. Borderline personality, again, is a big exemplar of that. For this group of people, then, adherence to treatment can be viewed as particularly consequential. Abilify MySite as a tracker of medication taking is seemingly poised to address this issue. However, as Durham and colleagues point out in 2018, we need to be very cautious about the paternalism that is often central to this standpoint. So they're right, the introduction and normalization of Abilify MySite represents the shifting sands of more circumscribed laws governing mandatory treatment, risking a gradual erosion of self-determination and personal freedom by erring on the side of risk aversion and paternalism. Mental health data are particularly complex and sensitive. They can have a host of consequences for people. And that underlines the importance of transparency, trust, and safety at a time of increased automation. Now, of course, a key reason for this includes the widespread stigma that commonly characterizes mental ill health. The potential for insurance companies to access this data to make decisions affecting one's life, and the endurance of coercive practices in many areas of the mental health system. These questions are critical, and it's really important that we continue to unpack them in the context of the sort of technological solutionism that is spread through health systems. So, for instance, by attending to the policy and regulatory implication of the ingestible sensor, Iliadis reminds us that embodied computing might be how computing acts on and through us, producing new power asymmetries with external regulators, not regulators, and administrators who have privileged access to the data generated. Now, of all the technologies that have been associated with and applied to mental health, and I've studied quite a few of them, the ingestible sensor could be characterized as the most emergent. And by emergent, I mean that firstly, it's a very new technology. It's less established compared to something like an app. And the case study, of course, is from 2017. And secondly, it's not widely available to the public, with purported potential still to be realized. Of course, all technology might be called emerging because their uses are continually shifting and the functionalities are changed and updated, and they become imagined and envisioned in other ways. So in their entanglements with present, futures, and remnants of past technologies, some of the technologies that the ingestible sensor relies on are quite old in the sense that they've been with us for a long time. Ingestible sensors represent a possible avenue for the expansion of digital mental health. And significantly, as Iliadis also writes about, they represent one of the least studied forms of visceral computing. Nonetheless, they represent an area of considerable investment. They also extend the reach of embodied computing into the multiple ontologies of bodies, ingestion and digestion, and mental health. Embodied computing denotes technologies that are material, body-centered, and that can be in, on, or around the body. Now, the ingestible sensor itself for mental health is unique in its movement and actions in the body, while being in constant communication with various devices that are tethered to the body and those connected to but distant from the body. So things like the digital portal, for instance, where intake can be tracked and monitored. So computing here occurs simultaneously near, on the surface, and inside the fleshy matter of bodies. In fact, computing in Abilify My Side depends completely on the rich potentialities of biology. So Elizabeth Gross, very well-known Australian feminist, I want to say she's Australian, yes. She observes, all the way in 1994, observed that biology is an open materiality. It's a set of possibly infinite tendencies and potentialities. Of importance here are the labors that the ingestible sensor brings to bear upon the body. The acts of swallowing and digesting the sensor to activate the production of data, followed by the excretion of materials. Critical engagements with biology, feminist theory, and the gut come to mind here, and bringing together biological research on digestion, clinical research on mental ill health and feminist theory. Elizabeth Wilson in 2015, in her fantastic book called Gut Feminism, argues that the functions of the gut are particularly important in producing and reflecting moods and affective states. The multiple functions of the gut to break down, absorb, metabolize, and its role in being like a distributory of sending messages and receiving messages and chemicals to the brain are highly generative. In the case of Abilify My Side, because the work of the psychotropic on the body cannot be extracted from the technology of the sensor, the user's state of mind and the flesh are the environment. They're generating a form of sort of viscous, fleshy technology human entanglement. This includes simultaneously symbiotic and passive from the inside actions of the technology, bodies and subjectivities that are enacted through the ingestible sensor. I've written about this elsewhere, and I've written that the entanglement of subjectivity, embodiment, and mental health and ill health, as well as the ingestible sensor, is processual, dynamic, and unsettled. Subjectivity is not just affected by the digital antipsychotic, but rather subjectivity and the digital antipsychotic emerge together and they become known differently. So, reliable data on the take-up of Abilify MySite is really hard to find. And it's hard to locate sort of to determine how successful the drug has been. But there are a lot of indicators that the drug is not successful, that the drug is not popular among consumers. We've reports that Proteus Digital Health furloughed many employees in 2019 and filed for bankruptcy in 2020. In addition, Otsuka Pharmaceutical Netherlands withdrew an application to the European Medicines Agency to market Abilify MySite in member states of the European Union. It's important to hold on to the limitations of the ingestible sensors for mental health. As these foreground, I think it's a fantastic case study in hype and how the hype that often characterizes technologies either fail to materialize or they materialize within strict boundaries, or the drug is deemed to have failed, but its premise triggers other innovations to be developed. So Nick Brown, who has written about the phenomenon of hype in technology, writes that technology development often occurs within cycles of hype and disappointment, awe and loathing. These cycles suggest that hype is as affective and magnetic as it is political and economized. It captures our attention. And even as we might react to an ingestible sensor for mental health with skepticism or concern, or maybe a bit of distaste, we might also invest in a dynamics of expectation that aims to paint a picture of a future or a scenario that might eventuate. Hype is likewise constituted and reproduced by political forces and economic investments. This becomes particularly salient in mental health care, given its political dimensions are often highlighted and critiqued. So hype, still citing from Nick Brown here, is far from morally neutral. It's imbued in values, in priorities, and commercial expectations. So in this context, the limitation and possible failures of Abilify MySite do not signify a complete disavowal of the technology and its potentials. Indeed, failure amidst the many promises of technological innovation bears interrogating. What is failure doing in this context? How is failure maybe repurposed in this context? Failure, when seen through the lens of hype, might not mean abandoning the technology, but rather fine-tuning it or repurposing it elsewhere. Failure might also mean a consideration of what else this technology can enable. So, for example, Abilify MySite might have enjoyed limited success, limited take-up, but the large data amassed by the ingestible sensor are just as important as the purported function or effectiveness of this drug. As I've discussed, it's important to note that the digital pharmaceutical is made up of new and old technologies that have been living with us for a very long time. By considering the many data collection and processing points of Abilify MySite, that is the sensor, the app, the wearable, the portal, the technology can be reframed as something of a success. But in this case, I mean the successful accumulation of data that can be put to use in other ways. Abilify MySite, in other words, is not only an ingestible sensor, it represents an all-encompassing collection of body data for a picture of deeply embodied mental health that both includes and exceeds the brain. This particular digital pharmaceutical might not be a commercial success, but it paves the way for other purported innovations that increasingly position mental health as not limited to the brain or the mind. Rather, these technologies suggest that it's necessary to collect data from the body as a whole. So not only whether I've taken my medicine, but also how I've rested today and how many steps I've taken and who I've spoken to. So it's interior and exterior, in order to both understand and address mental ill health and mental health. Now, on the one hand, we might view this positively. We might think, well, this represents potentially a more holistic, social, and embodied approach to mental health, akin to what a lot of social researchers, such as myself, have highlighted. Here, brain, body, and the viscous interiority of body and social life all matter in order to understand mental health and in health. On the other hand, this also means that collecting large masses of data is near essential and unavoidable in order to manifest the potentials of digital technologies and their capacity for capturing and processing all this data. So the digital pharmaceutical then, to finish, prompts questions about what kinds of future we want to imagine for mental health care. The digitalization of mental health in the shape of the digital pharmaceutical raises important questions about the kinds of care that's envisioned by corporations and individuals and the kinds of people who are attached to those different technologies. In recent decades, technology has profoundly shaken how mental health is framed within public discourse. A new kind of frontier thinking almost has emerged where the potentials of technologies are foregrounded. So I can think of things like computational psychiatry, digital precision psychiatry, and of course, the potential of generative AI in mental health. These are often accompanied by alliances between corporations and some clinicians that wish to sort of disrupt existing models of care. Solutions to long-standing problems in the system are viewed as inevitably and inescapably digital. Our task, I think, is to, of course, interrogate these models, whether and how they work and for whom, but importantly, what kinds of hierarchies of knowledge and experience they are producing and reproducing. Thanks very much, everyone.